To welcome our first speaker of this session, we have Anya Lamb, who's the Senior Manager of Native Vegetation Strategy with the Department of Water and Environmental Regulation. So Anya will talk to us about the native vegetation policy for WA and how we're going to be using this to deliver net gain and also landscape scale conservation. Anya has 20 years of experience leading collaborative programs. She has a strong focus on science policy integration. She loves focusing on how to simplify complex systems and develop feasible solutions so that we can make systems work better. She's led the Native Vegetation Policies team for WA since 2019, and I believe is also a very enthusiastic ukulele player still. If I can add that.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Melanie, and hello, everyone. So I'm Anya Lamb, Senior Manager of Native Vegetation Strategy at DWER. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country upon which we meet today and those online from where you're coming from, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Noting also that we've got people from across WA today and various countries, and where we are today is on Whadjuk Noongar country. I also recognise traditional owners' continuing connection, knowledge, care for the land and waters that we'll speak of in the topic covering today. Thanks. All right. So in this talk, we'll cover the native vegetation's policies focus on net gain and landscape scale restoration. And to do that, we'll cover what is the native vegetation policy and why is it needed, including some of the context of Commonwealth reform and also how it might influence local governments, and also some things about definitions and measuring net gain under the native vegetation policy and opportunities for achieving it. The policy commits to 22 roadmap actions by 13 state agencies. The actions include improved strategic whole of government policy making and coordination, including regional planning, contemporising agency practices for decision making and data capture, and that's about efficiency, transparency and data sharing, and it's aligned with some of the principles in other bigger picture state strategies like Streamline WA, the Open Data Policy and the Digital Strategy. And the policy is about improving environmental outcomes, including a net gain at landscape scale, as well as about clearer decision-making for business certainty and efficiency. It's also about trying to find ways to manage native vegetation that will generate economic opportunities for regional and Aboriginal people, leverage private investment for ecosystem restoration, and also enable sustainable economic development and infrastructure for state prosperity. The policy is needed for better coordination because native vegetation management, it won't surprise any of you, is highly decentralised across many authorities. We've counted 25 acts, more than 10 agencies involved, and that's just at state level across multiple portfolios, not just environment. And that reflects 38 exemptions to clearing approvals under state environmental law. Let's flick through to this next bit. And that means that many stakeholders of many different kinds take many decisions that affect it every day. And some are regulated, many aren't. They have diverse goals and they span the public, private and conservation sectors. There are also, even just within the regulatory space, multiple regulators at all levels of government, various funding sources with diverse goals for restoring it, and also a range of land managers, public and private. And that makes it really hard to get strategic, coordinated outcomes from the various decisions that are being made. And it's why a whole of government policy is needed, so that we can draw on government's diverse functions and powers in a more coordinated way than has been done before, in order to guide this complex system with many players, many of them beyond regulation and much beyond the environment portfolio. There's a bit more on the policy scope on page 18 of the policy for those interested. Just a note on local governments. Local governments aren't bound by this state coordination policy, but rather the state government's policies, practices and services work together to influence local government choices in carrying out functions that have high influence over native vegetation outcomes. So just some examples: land use planning and approvals as bushland and land managers, as core sources of influence and information for their communities and landholders, and also as a developer that needs state approvals for things that require clearing, and perhaps even as a buyer of environmental offsets, or maybe even as a supplier of one. And we'll explore some of those opportunities arising from those roles later in the talk. A quick note on the Commonwealth environmental reforms. The Nature Positive Plan was released in December last year. It responds to the State of the Environment report and the 2020 Independent Review of Commonwealth Environmental Law, the Samuel Review. Both had really strong themes about the need for better coordination across a range of functions and activities, across industry, government and the community, including land planning, regulatory decisions, programs, conservation investment, and also better information. And it also had was talking about clearer signals to guide developers in more sustainable proposal design. The Samuel Review was done over a really similar time frame through which we were consulting on the native vegetation policy through 2020-21. And that means that it's no surprise that it had similar findings and proposed similar solutions, such as the need for strategic regional environmental planning. The Nature Positive Plan seeks to reverse biodiversity loss and achieve nature positive outcomes aligned to Australia's commitments under the International Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which one of the example goals in that is reserving 30% of lands and waters by 2023. So some pretty ambitious goals here, including initiatives to reform environmental laws with new standards, establish regional planning to coordinate regulation with programs and to involve local and Aboriginal people. And it also flags that the scale of environmental decline in Australia is so large that government investment alone isn't going to be sufficient to halt and reverse the decline, and hence it seeks to establish a new nature repair market to leverage private sector investment in natural capital. For more information, I'd encourage you to have a look at their website. I will flag their reform timeframes are ambitious, and the WA government as a whole of government has been working pretty hard on responding to the pieces that we've been given to achieve the best reform outcomes for WA, and we anticipate that they'll be releasing something for public comment before the end of the year. Just a quick note on defining and measuring net gain. Net gain means that improvements to under the policy means improvements to extent and condition in native vegetation exceed the losses at landscape scale. So we're not talking a requirement at proposal scale for offsets. We're talking big picture, taking into account the sum total of all stakeholder actions that influence it, whether they're regulated, voluntary or otherwise. Landscape scale reflects the need to manage ecological processes across space, jurisdiction and time, and with a focus on connectivity and resilience. The policy seeks to address some of the challenges in defining and measuring net gain by laying out that those people working on roadmap actions in the back of the policy should first explore how a net gain in both condition and extent might be defined and measured for that action, including appropriate baselines and timeframes. And that definition should either be adopted to guide the work or an alternative defined and justified. So an example of that is in constrained land use areas. It might be really challenging to commit to a net gain in extent, but it might be better to commit more feasible to commit to a net gain in condition and connectivity of remnants. Note, however, that the Commonwealth solution in their regional planning space is to include a broader boundary than the area of development focus. So that boundary needs to be able to deliver a net positive outcome, noting that development might be intense in the development zone. Just another note on measuring it. Under the Native Veg policy, we received funding to pilot a new WA vegetation extent mapping system so that we can set up, or we can make informed investment in a future statewide semi-automated vegetation extent mapping system. So that's action 3.1 in the back of the policy. That pilot will test and develop a new efficient approach and robust approach to a state extent data set. I'm sure some of you have been using for many years the old DAFWA or DPIRD, native veg current extent. So this is about getting some sustainable resourcing in place, noting that these kinds of mapping tools underpin veg type statistics, which are critical to decision making by authorities, including local governments, the EPA and the WAPC. So they're really big decision tools and we need to make sure they're robust. Okay, so just on to opportunities, the first of which is regional planning. So what is it? Regional planning under the policy recognises that we're not starting from scratch in this space. Existing regimes are in place for land use planning, including at local government level and also state. So under the policy, it must develop products that help the existing systems work better and in more coordinated ways. And we're lucky that we actually are free to define the outputs that are needed to meet the system's need. So those could include things like policies, plans, maps, guidance, or robust updates to things that already exist. Also consolidations of existing work to produce things like conservation and restoration plans that would identify opportunities to buffer or connect existing bushland, which will help identify offsets opportunities. It means we can deliver benefits and approvals clarity and better environmental outcomes in a staged way into the existing system, even ahead of any statutory endorsed plan. And that's what makes it different from systems like the strategic assessment of the Perth and Peel, where it was a big bang at the end and you only won if you managed to get it over the line. Just a note on objectives and outcomes. This is about actually consolidating. There's lots of objectives and outcomes and strategic landscapes plans. This is about being able to pull together a more tangible set of outcomes, and that will help with coordinating multiple activities in different spheres like land planning, approvals, grants and voluntary investment. Government has so far committed to regional planning in the Wheatbelt and the Perth and Peel regions. Those teams, once fully resourced, will have 3 people. So far, each has 1 senior environmental officer, of which we have them in the room today. Do you want to raise your hands, Renat and Christine? And their focus at the moment is setting up the ecosystem mapping and values information that are going to be needed regardless of what other outputs that stakeholders need. The Commonwealth's currently developing its regional planning framework, so it's a bit of a moving feast, and they call it flying the plane, building the plane, building the plane while they're flying it. So we're keeping sight of those reforms to make sure whatever we produce will be able to plug into that system. I just want to give a nod to local and lot scale management of biodiversity by local government, including by all your existing tools like zoning, local biodiversity plans or urban forest plans. And regional planning must involve and build on these and develop a broader consolidated view. Secondly, I think we heard this a little bit from Andrew this morning, but where land use is constrained, if we actually are going to achieve the goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss, we've got to move beyond this binary development and environment conflicts and start figuring out how to integrate nature into developed landscapes. There's a really good case for this. One of the big challenges we're all facing is constraints to state and Commonwealth environmental approvals. And the biodiversity decline is actually the root cause of these approval challenges. So if we can have a credible and practical plan to reverse it, it will directly support regulators' confidence to grant approvals. Another key piece in the back of the roadmap, noting there's 22 actions, and this is just a few of them, environmental offsets and also strategic restoration. So DWER's been trying to pursue offsets reforms for quite a while to make them work. As a regulatory agency, we've looked first at our own powers and functions to make rules about the kinds of offsets needed for a given impact. But it's become really clear that we can't resolve the challenges that stakeholders are coming to us with. Just using regulatory policy is the only tool. To make them work, there's got to be a supply of them. And broader economic policy influences this, including how current policy settings actively disincentivise the use of land for conservation. if we can successfully address some of these big picture drivers, then we'll also set the scene for a successful voluntary strategic restoration projects, including the nature repair market. And it'll make WA more attractive to emerging corporate investment in natural capital, and that'll bring economic diversification and job opportunities in cities and regions. Just noting that some other states have, you know, thriving business opportunities for contractors in this space, and I think there's opportunity for that to emerge in WA. The barriers to strategic restoration broadly fall into three categories: the lack of an agreed vision and strategy, so those clear outcomes and objectives that drive strategy, as opposed to, you know, rules like preserve this proportion of this type of veg. A lack of accessible information and technical guidance, and also a supply chain for the restoration economy, so things like a lack of services, materials and land. And as you can see from the breadth of these, addressing them needs a multi-agency and multi-portfolio response, and lots of expertise other than a bunch of enviros like me. After a period of engaging our state agency colleagues on these complex things that are needed, DWER's gearing up to consult on these barriers and solutions, and we'll be sure to engage local government sector. Just a quick finish on the points of influence. Local governments every day are influencing biodiversity outcomes through your usual business. So as I'd flagged, it will be on that regional planning process to build on the excellent work that local governments are already doing to articulate a consolidated broader vision and strategy. And just some of the roles that local governments are core in delivering are on the slide, and I'm sure I've already learned about some new ones this morning. I'm sure I'll learn more through the day, and I'm also happy to be set straight later. And the products of regional planning have to be fit for purpose to support those roles, so that local governments willingly wish to give effect to those objectives within their policy settings. A couple of curious questions, which maybe people can catch me after and give me some ideas on. So what kinds of tools are needed to support you in your roles that regional planning could produce? And another curious question about the level of integration between local biodiversity strategies and urban forest strategies in your areas, and opportunities to integrate them more. In terms of the Native Edge Policy Roadmap, we see local governments as key partners in the regional planning process, and noting that local government interest in reforms for offsets and strategic restoration might be high, there may be other things in there. So we'll welcome inquiries or inputs of any kind, and if you've got questions, please email nbs@dwer.wa.gov.au. Thanks.
Thank you, Anya. Are there any questions for Anya on the native vegetation policy reform areas? Yes, up the back.
So if we focus in on the area relevant to Perth and Peel, back in August, we've been running some interagency consultations because, as you know, we're not starting from scratch here. There are multiple mapping products. So we've been using our interagency senior officers group to determine what the priority updates are and actually make decisions about which products we need to build on and take forward. And we've got a scope now, so we're working on getting resources in place to get that running.
And the collaboration and engagement with local government on the regional planning area, has that commenced or will commence?
Yeah, that's right. So as I've said, there's a lot moving in this space at the moment with Commonwealth reforms. The Commonwealth is seeking to produce a regional planning framework, which will actually share with us what their plans are for it. Yeah. So our initial focus with the resources that we've got started on, which, as I've described, is only part of the team, are very much focused on getting that baseline mapping done. I'm not sure if it will be a surprise to anyone, but WA has room to grow in terms of our mapping and data governance, and that robustness around the decision making, even things like agreeing what the definition is for veg mapping, agreeing what remnant and regrowth is. And so we can't stress how important that the technical piece of mapping needs to be backed by strong, robust interagency governance around those agreements. Otherwise, it's not fit for purpose to push into the policy framework. And that's what we've been spending our time on to date, is getting that stuff set up, those foundations.
Any other questions? Okay, I'm sure that we will stay in touch as this develops and there's opportunities for input and feedback from local government. Walga's also doing a piece on offsets to assist the department. So we've asked for case studies from local government and those are being fed through at the moment. I'd now like to move on to our next presentation. We have Coralie Claudio, who's our Senior Policy Advisor of Planning with Walga here. So Coralie is a town planner with over 12 years experience in local government in statutory planning, and she's worked for both inner metropolitan and also the outer growth councils. Coralie was the coordinator of planning at the City of Wanneroo before she joined us at Walga last year. Coralie was responsible for coordinating the legal advice on Walga's tree retention issues paper. And today, Coralie will share mechanisms for better tree retention through the planning system and the outcomes of that legal advice. Thank you.
Is this working?
Yeah, it's very bored and that.
Great, thank you. Thanks Mel. Hi everybody. So as Mel has mentioned, I will be presenting on tree retention in the planning system. I'll particularly focus on tree retention on private land. And I will focus on the legal advice that we received on the issues paper that Walga produced last year. We only just recently received that legal advice, probably a month ago. So it's a hot topic of conversation. So I'll provide a little bit of background first on the issues paper and legal advice and on the urban forest issue, I guess, more generally. So I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but obviously, I guess trees in that urban area are significant because they contribute to social, economic and environmental benefits to the community. A couple of figures here, they're a little bit old, but they still probably stand true. We are losing tree canopy in that urban environment, particularly on private land, and it's having a big impact. So what are you guys in terms of local government and what has Walga been doing about it? So we established the Urban Forest Working Group in 2019. And the purpose of this working group was to, I guess, build capacity in the sector and to take collective actions on agreed priorities. In 2021, the working group identified some focus areas, and one of those being tree retention, and an expert subcommittee was formed. And obviously from there, we produced the issues paper and we've got the legal advice. One other thing that we have done most recently, we've updated our advocacy position on urban forests, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. So the tree retention issues paper. So this paper was produced by Walga end of last year in close consultation with the tree retention subcommittee. The issue paper identified a number of key challenges local government was having in terms of retaining trees. And it sort of was broken up into two sections. One, it had some scenarios that local governments had faced in the context of tree retention in an urban area. And the next section was some additional questions relating to the current policy and legislative framework in WA and its capacity for tree retention. So underlying a lot of the scenarios and questions in the issues paper was this, I guess, fundamental uncertainty regarding if removing a tree was considered works or development in a planning context, and if removing a tree required a development application. Because historically, we haven't been doing that. We haven't been requiring development applications in those cases. So the issues paper was refined earlier this year to pose questions to be answered by legal advice. And we engaged McLeod's lawyers to undertake this work. The legal advice was finalised, like I said, last month. And so far, approximately 50 local governments had purchased that legal advice, and we ran an information session a couple of weeks ago on the legal advice. So the legal advice is confidential. So I can't present all of the findings of the legal advice, and it's also a 50-page document. So it is a bit of a boring read, but For the purpose of this presentation, in terms of tree retention on private land, I will present some of the key findings from the legal advice and talk about what local governments can do in this space and what WALGA is going to do in this space. So, what are the key findings? Yes, tree removal is considered works and it is considered development. When you look at the definition of works under the Local Planning Scheme regulations and the definition of development under the Planning and Development Act, they are very broad, so they encompass a lot of things. So therefore, removing a tree does fall within that category. So then the very next important question obviously is, do you need a development application to remove a tree? Unfortunately, the answer, of course, that we got from a lawyer is maybe, because I guess that's because in a planning context, works have to be significant enough to warrant a development application. So to determine if it's significant enough, you need to consider a range of different factors, and it will be determined on a case-by-case basis. Some of the factors might be the size, the location, you know, if it's a landmark element, you know, a tree in your backyard that's a tiny tree and you knock it over, probably not going to warrant a development application. A big tree in your front yard, that's an important species that contributes to the streetscape. Well, yes, you're probably going to meet that threshold where you need a development application. Not very helpful, but what it means is that you need to get your planning system in place to clearly identify in what circumstances you need to, you know, what circumstances a tree needs a DA to be removed. The legal advice also recommended a two-tiered approach, and the two-tiered being, one, clarify when you need a DA for tree removal, and we're going to call this a regulated tree, and two, provide additional protection for those individual trees that are that have pure significance in their own rights. And I will talk to both of those next. So these are the current, I guess, statutory mechanisms that we can use. I'm going to probably skip over this quickly because I am going to talk about that next. But apart from noting, local governments are already doing this to some extent at the moment. So this is quite important. You need to establish a clear criteria in terms of what trees need a DA if you're going to remove those trees. We recommend you call this a regulated tree, but it's up to you in terms of the terminology. We recommend a good start would be using the definition of significant tree from the medium density codes, forgetting that we don't know what's going on with the medium density codes. It's still a good start. And so obviously it's very prescriptive. It's not ambiguous, it's very prescriptive. It talks about the tree height, the tree canopy, the trunk size, and all of those things. So step one, work out what you want to retain and what needs a DA and make that very clear and precise. Step two, clarify that if you're removing that tree of that particular size and criteria, you need a development application to remove that tree. And step three, if you want, clearly identify if there's exemptions. So it might be the case that a tree meets these dimensions, but you don't really want a DA for it. So it might be a palm tree or a fruit tree or something like that, and you don't care. So clarify what those exemptions are as well. So how can you introduce this into your planning framework? So you've got two options really. You've got your local planning scheme provisions, or you can introduce it into a local development plan. Pros and cons to both options. Scheme provisions are certain and final, but they are timely to prepare and they require the approval of the Minister for Planning. And so ultimately it's up to the Minister to make the determination, not the local government. Local planning policies are due regard documents, so they are less certain, particularly if they haven't been tested through the SAT system, which this hasn't. But they're easier to prepare and they only require the local government to adopt them. So I just wanted to touch on two different case studies that have followed the two different approaches. The City of Nedlands Scheme Amendment, many of you might have heard of this one, but It's proposing to introduce scheme provisions in terms of requiring a DA to remove a large tree. So that's a bit larger than the definition I mentioned before. They're looking at, I think it's 6 metre canopy, 8 metres in height, and only in a low residential area, so R20 or below. They will be doing a local planning policy just to guide the scheme amendment and to support the scheme amendment. So what's happened with this scheme amendment is that it was considered by the WPC last year, so quite some time ago, over a year ago, where they recommended, don't do this, do a significant tree register instead. Now, the City of Netherlands did look at this and they decided no, significant tree registers, which I will talk about in a little bit, but they only protect individual trees. They don't protect, I guess, broad, all the trees that would fall in this sort of category to be a large tree. So proceeded with doing their scheme amendment, went out for advertising. It got supported by their council in March of this year. It is currently with the Minister for Planning for final determination. So we haven't heard what's going on, but I think the advice that they received in September of last year, you know, a lot's happened in that time. WALGA's run their urban forest conference. We've updated our advocacy position. We've got a new Minister for Planning. The medium density codes, we're not quite sure what's going on with those. So, you know, the context of the planning system a year ago and tree retention has changed quite significantly. So this is critical, this decision, to determine what other local governments do in this space. So watch this space and see. Another option though is just to do, like I mentioned, local planning policy. So this is what the City of Kalamunda are doing. They have a local planning policy in place. They don't call it regulated tree, they call it tree worthy of retention, but they basically define what a tree worthy of retention is. I think it's quite similar to that medium density code definition. And they obviously clarified that you need a development application if you're going to remove this tree. They have a number of list of exemptions as well. And I believe one of those exemptions is if you're doing a single house that requires the removal of the tree, but the single house is exempt from needing a development application because it complies with the residential design codes, then that's exempt from needing an approval. My understanding, there's prosecuted some people, so they've fined a number of people for removing trees on their land. But I believe this is removing groups of trees, so sort of 20 or up. So I don't think there has been a case where it's been prosecuted just for removal of a single tree, to my knowledge. Please let me know if you know, because I'd love to hear about it. So that's your tier one. So your tier one is what tree needs a development application. Your tier two, in terms of protecting trees, is those additional protections for individual trees. So because they have individually, they are significant, and they could be significant for a number of reasons. They could be a net landmark element. They could be just due to their size, their ecological value. But for whatever reason, that particular individual tree on that site is significant. So you've got a couple of different options in the planning system. You've got a significant tree register, tree preservation orders, but basically this puts additional provisions on those individual trees. And if you want to remove them or damage them, even prune them in some cases, in some ways, you need to get council approval to do that. This wasn't really touched on in the legal advice, but I think it's worth noting, you know, you could look at tree retention in terms of incentives. So you could offer developer bonuses such as height or plot ratio. This was the intent of what the medium density codes were going to do. You could offer incentives through the planning process themselves in terms of, you know, fast tracking a development application or discounting or waiving fees. While I definitely support these approaches, this obviously relies on a development application to be required and in the system before you can implement these things. So the next thing is you've got your planning framework in place. It clarifies when you need a development application to remove a tree. Then you get your development application. So I guess this is the role of the local government and the planners at local governments to do a balanced case-by-case assessment of that particular application to determine in that situation, based on your planning framework, is the removal of the tree appropriate? And that may be different depending on the application that you're considering, depending on if you can pull some levers, if you can vary some things to allow maybe reduction of car parking or reduction of setbacks to accommodate the tree. So the main point I want to make it here is get your planning frameworks in place so you can do that detailed planning assessment and you've got your local planning policy to back you up in terms of retaining trees once you receive those development applications. Conditions and enforcements. Okay, so another thing that you can do is once you get a development application, it may be reasonable that you include a condition on a development application for a tree, an existing significant tree, to be retained. Or another option is that you can potentially include a condition that a new tree is planted and that tree is maintained and replaced, for example, if that's necessary in the planning framework. So this gives you the option to capture those maturing trees that you probably are not going to capture in your regulated tree definition, because your regulated tree definition is only going to capture those trees of a certain size already. So if it's appropriate and if the planning framework allows it, you can include a condition for the planting and maintenance of new trees. And another thing just I wanted to touch on is enforcement. So under the Planning and Development Act, we do have a couple of options in terms of enforcement if people decide to remove their trees. Unfortunately, obviously, once a tree is removed, it's removed. So you're losing that value. But you've got the option of either instructing them to plant a new one of a similar size potentially, or prosecuting, so fining them. So obviously the fining is not going to bring the tree back, but at least going to be a bit of a disincentive for them to knock the tree over in the first place. So where to from here for WALGA and local government? So based on the findings of the legal advice, WALGA is looking at preparing a model local planning policy that all local governments can use. They can obviously tweak it to suit their own individual needs. We'll probably base this local planning policy of the City of Kallamunda's one, because that one is quite comprehensive. And we will probably be recommending a definition for regulated tree within that local planning policy. Obviously, local planning policies are adopted by local governments and they have the option of varying and putting whatever provisions in that they want. But I think for consistency's sake, for us to keep advocating to the state government of the importance of tree retention, having some sort of consistent definition of a regulated tree would be very helpful. In terms of further advocacy to the state government, we have provided high-level feedback on this legal advice to the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage. Obviously, we haven't given them a copy of that legal advice, because it's owned by us and the 50 local governments that have purchased it. But we will continue to advocate to the state government of the importance of tree retention in the state planning framework, and for there to be some sort of state planning mechanisms in terms of tree retention. The last thing I did want to touch on is just our urban forest advocacy position. We have recently updated this position, as I mentioned at the start. I've just included a little snippet there, but we basically are requesting that the state government, in consultation with local government, develop contemporary legislative and policy mechanisms to consider the removal of significant or regulated trees as a form of development and to incentivise tree retention. So watch this space. And I think that is it from me. So thank you for listening. If you haven't already joined our Urban Forest Working Group, or if you'd like to be part of our Urban Forest Working Group to progress some of this work, please get in contact with us, the planning and building team at WALGA. Thanks.
Thank you, Coralie. There's been a huge amount of work that's happened in this area over the past 12 months or so. So fantastic work for the team and also the local governments we work with in that Urban Forest Working Group. Are there any questions for Coralie? Yes, thank you.
Work has set criteria for where we may consider tree removal. So they sort of probably think we got through on the basis they pre-existed. So they've just sort of continued but it's interesting from a whether
Yeah, and I think the Nedland scheme amendment will be a good indicator in terms of what the Minister for Planning is thinking in relation to whether or not he's prepared to embed, I guess, tree retention provisions in schemes. So that will be very much a good test case. I know when they advertised consistent local planning schemes and the reforms they're doing around that earlier in the year, I think they suggested including a significant tree register in the model provisions, I believe it was. So I know they are looking in this space, but I don't know how far they want to go down in terms of embedding it into that local planning framework or into the local planning scheme, particularly at the deemed provision stage. And that's why I think it's very critical that obviously local governments do this work, but the more we can do it consistently, we can advocate to the state government, hey, we're all doing the same thing. Why don't you just put this in the local planning scheme provisions? Yeah. I know. That is all I know. Yeah, unfortunately. It's been there quite a while. So yeah, look, we're just waiting. We're waiting to hear. We will obviously communicate the decision out as soon as we know. We do have a planning and building newsletter, which is a monthly newsletter that goes out. If anyone's interested in signing up, please do. We communicate those decisions out. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we are now onto our second presenter. Third. We have Stephen Schreck, who's the Strategic Projects Officer with the Shire of Augusta Margaret River. So Stephen has been a Strategic and Statutory Planning Officer at both inner city and regional local governments. Stephen is passionate about finding ways to deliver effective policy for a better standard of development. His current role involves future strategic planning, both for the Shire as a whole, but also for the town centres within the Shire. Today, Stephen will share with us the Shire's new sustainability requirements for residential developments. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. It's kind of interesting being on this side after hearing Andrew's presentation this morning, because he was one of my lecturers at uni almost 10 years ago. So it's almost deja vu, but quite nice to sort of see where we've come in the last 10 years, and that kind of dovetails into where we've arrived with the Shire's new sustainability requirements. So yeah, I guess I'll start by saying, where has this come from, or why are we doing this? We have had quite a long history or a long dialogue with our community about sustainability, environmental sustainable design, carbon emissions and the like with our community. So it's really been a community-led position from the Shire, or to the Shire, sorry, and it's come through in both our local planning strategy and our climate action plan that we have in place. So obviously, as Andrew touched on this morning, the local planning strategy is the overarching strategic document that the community has quite a lot of input into, and that kind of guides where we're going to head for the next 15 years. In our case, it's till 2036, sets out a lot of the development potential, development areas, environmental regulation and environmental protection that's going to go forward. Our particular sustainability or sustainable development outcomes were flagged by the community and by us through that local planning strategy, and then was ultimately, endorsed by the state to give us that surety to go forward and proceed that further. That was strongly backed by our climate action plan. So our council, our community and Shire staff have a really strong commitment to reducing our carbon emissions as a Shire. By 2030, all of our Shire buildings are envisaged to be net zero carbon emissions, and we're strongly encouraging all of our community members to help us in that through residential development and the practices that they do. And we are ambitiously trying to achieve net carbon zero by 2030 Shire-wide across all positions, and that's a position that's been endorsed by council. So this is really strongly backed by that. That was done through the community through a climate action summit and was led by the community. And this particular sustainable development point came from a key priority action from the community at that summit. So yeah, it really has been a community-led push for really the last probably 10 years to arrive at this point. I guess the other thing from a planning sense, and a kind of tongue-in-cheek McMansion comment, but if anyone isn't aware, Australia has recently become the highest or the largest average house size in the world. And unfortunately, WA leads the trend in the largest average WA house size across all states in Australia. So we kind of feel that there's that concerning trend of that continuing. It's been on an upward trend over the last 5 or 6 years and just continues to roll out. So, we're looking at ways that we can sort of mitigate that or incentivize that to not be the case anymore and deliver a more sustainable model of housing. So yeah, as I mentioned, it's been a community-led process, but, once you get that community support, you've still got to implement what goes on. And that's been quite a long process. Andrew touched on this morning how long developing a local planning strategy and a local planning scheme is. So we're kind of in the process of our local planning strategy has been done, but our local planning scheme is still it's currently out for advertising. So in terms of where we got to with our sustainability or sustainable development outcomes, we went through a very rigorous process of developing those. We had internal drafts done with our sustainability staff, planning staff, environmental staff, and they were tested and reviewed and peer reviewed by an independent consultant who looked at it from 2 angles. It's increasingly heightened now, but housing affordability is a massive issue in Perth, Australia, the Shire particularly. So there was kind of 2 lenses put on by the consultant, and one was to be, how can we get the most net positive impact of our sustainable development requirements and also not affect housing affordability in a negative way. Obviously, we're talking about, I'll get into the provisions a little bit more, but we're talking about things like, double glazing, solar panels, better water efficiency, all things that kind of have an upfront cost on housing. So the consultant that we appointed looked at, what are the features that we can arrive at or that we can provide that will get the best net positive outcome without having a real negative impact on housing affordability. And that was kind of where we started from. And then we also have an internal sustainable advisory committee, which is a group of community members and council members as well as staff. And we run that through, monthly or I can't actually remember how often they are, but we run those provisions through the meetings and they are able to provide, their comment through this whole process. So you can kind of see that it's been quite a rigorous testing process the whole way through. What we ended up with was basically a list of 9 features that would be on a sliding scale. Now that sliding scale that you can see in those bottom 3 dot points, that's really geared at the housing affordability model. So the way that it works is if you're building a smaller house, we're not going to, add a lot of requirements of sustainability, sustainable design onto that. because people who are looking to move into that housing may be of the lower socioeconomic status or the lower income status. So the idea was to kind of have a sliding scale where, you know, if you are achieving a larger house, right up, that covers right up through to, you know, your 500 square meter mansions on large pieces of land, you're going to run into the need to have the highest level of sustainable design in those houses. That's also based on the fact that those houses that are larger also have the largest impact on the environment, and also have the largest impact, you know, in terms of raw materials, heating, cooling, all those things that kind of go into the operation of a house. We also had a first draft to be above the NCC, 1 star above the NCC standard. So for anyone who doesn't know, the NCC is the National Construction Code, and that basically sets out a minimum energy efficiency rating. Currently that sits at 6 stars. We wanted to do plus 1 star of the NCC standard, which would have brought it up to a 7. And I'll talk a little bit more about that from the changes that were made. So as I sort of mentioned, our provisions pretty much focused around, you know, needing to have a solar system, so a photovoltaic system, rainwater tanks, which are, you know, offset the water use of the house, so pulling less from scheme water where it's possible, grey water reuse system, double glazing throughout. We wanted to try and make sure that external spaces as well didn't have large areas of, you know, paving or hard stand. That's kind of a killer for energy efficiency because it just creates a heat island effect. And then, yeah, we also wanted to maintain, and I guess this kind of leads on from what the previous presentation was about. We kind of incentivize an existing tree as being one of your, retaining that existing tree as being one of your sustainability features that will meet one of the 2, 3, or 4 requirements. And then, yeah, the rest of them sort of go on in terms of trees and shading of houses. I think a big one as well is, you know, something as simple as the placement of a main living area on a northern side. For some reason, we continue to see houses facing south, getting no natural sunlight into living areas. And that's such an easy fix that can be fixed in a site responsive way, rather than just plonking a cookie cutter design that's the same as your neighbour in the same way over and again and again and again. And that can significantly increase the thermal efficiency of a house and reduce the amount of mechanical heating and cooling that you need to do. And something as simple as that is one of the features that we've included. So what happened from there is obviously we needed to go to the state to ask for permission to advertise those requirements. And what they've come back with is, in a way, they've added some provisions. So you can see that we went from, 9 to 11. So they've added, or 8 to 11. So they've added some provisions in there. The provisions that we proposed remained relatively unchanged. Really, the only thing that changed is the removal of the 1 star above the NCC. In an ideal world, we would see that remain, and we would see, above and beyond what is required. But in a practical sense, the NCC is being updated as we speak anyway, and you're going to be requiring a minimum of 7 shortly anyway. So it kind of achieved our intended goal anyway. So that's kind of coming on in the future. And then they just sort of raised the average or the dwelling sizes. And that's probably in response to the type of housing and a more staggered approach towards where we're moving, because I guess 100 square metres is quite a small house in today's context. So they felt that it might be a more stepped approach to go, let's go 150 and upwards from there. So that's where we've arrived at, and that's what's currently being advertised in our scheme. Now they also added some things in there about, making a fully accessible dwelling. So that kind of plays into not only the environmental sustainability factor, but also the social and economic factor that comes with sustainability as well, because it's not all about protecting the environment, which is what we so often go to. It's also about the social and economic benefits that these provisions can have. So since we sort of drafted that, as I said, that's sort of 4 years ago that those original provisions were drafted. A lot's changed in the world. A lot's been touched on today, but, for people who don't know, Victoria recently moved away from any new gas connections to houses. So you've got all electric houses coming on now, which we're 100% on board with. We're sort of looking to start that conversation with people through structure planning processes or through the initial development phases to get people off gas. And that kind of comes from the Climate Action Plan again, getting people away from that, installing off-grid systems helps to reduce our carbon emissions and helps us to get that net zero carbon emissions by 2030. We've encouraged and will be looking to continue to encourage the use of life cycle assessments. So a life cycle assessment takes the development that you're proposing, regardless of scale, and it's a company that runs an assessment of all the way from extraction of mineral from up in the Pilbara or wherever it's made, shipping to China for the steel to be made, shipping to be made back, the carbon embodiment that's inside that steel or wood or anything like that, and then overall how much carbon emissions your house is going to produce, how much water it's going to produce, and that's a system that any house can pay for. So we're currently running a program for 20 free guided assessments, and that's kind of a commitment that we've made to help people get this, so people can go along with their single house, have it assessed the whole way through, and then that company can recommend changes. It might be, we're going to have an all steel framed house, and that's going to have a significant carbon embodiment. We'll change that to a timber from a sustainably sourced location, and that significantly reduces the carbon embodiment that goes into a house. So we're looking to move that, and that's become like a little bit more of a mainstream development process. And it's something that I know some inner city local governments are already using. Vincent, for one, use life cycle assessments for larger developments as a standard. And we're just sort of, moving towards the housing affordability model. Smaller dwellings are coming online, more efficient dwellings are coming online. The need to make cost of living go slightly less. I'm not sure. This is not my work. Giving away all the secrets. I just briefly touch on the claim. I think that Andrew sort of touched on it as well, but the policy positions and the political landscape is changing a lot, and it's changed a lot in the 4 years since we drafted this. So there's a lot more support for this sort of thing. So it'll be really interesting. I was driving here this morning, unfortunately but I was driving here this morning, and the ABC was reporting on the fact that the state government is committing to getting away from fossil fuels by 2030 and trying to move towards renewable energies. So we kind of feel that we're just moving in that direction as well, and hopefully a lot more will be done in that space. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're up to the stage now. We're not quite as lucky as Andrew, where his has been approved by the state yet, but we're waiting on that. So we're at the stage now where we've been given consent to advertise our local planning scheme. As I mentioned, there's been a long community drive in terms of environmental values. So if you do want to go and have a look, we've obviously environmental sustainable design in housing or residential development is one avenue that we've taken, but we do tackle a lot of other things through environmental conservation zones and other planning frameworks or planning tools that can be used. So I'd encourage anyone to go along. You can go to our Your Say AMR Shire website. Have a look there. You download the whole scheme, have a look at it, provide comment to us. We're happy to chat. And that's a pretty brief overview, but any questions, happy to take them.
Any questions for Steve before we move on? Yeah.
About the life cycle.
Mhm.
So I think that's what about our plan is they were released.
Mhm.
I think that's what the board. You know how it's about, or it's not mandated?
No, it's not a mandated,
Sorry.
yeah.
I'll just repeat the question for people online. The question was about life cycle assessments and whether that's mandated.
No, so it's not a mandated process. So it's just an above and beyond sort of service that we're offering. So we have a couple of internal sustainability officers, and they're kind of the ones that are driving this climate action plan from an implementation point of view. So one of the things that they're doing is, trying to get the word out there on the products that are available, or, you know, things that they see are valuable through the process. And one that the life cycle assessment is definitely one of those. But yeah, no, at the moment it's just on the individual person to do it. So really it needs to come from, a management or a council level as a sort of implementation or a governance sort of thing that your local government does. And I know that, you know, that's what happened at Vincent or other local governments. It was sort of a local government position to move in that direction to get better sustainable outcomes in that way, or having a tool to assess that. So yeah.
And were your sustainability requirements and the provisions you've put in there based on something that's been tried and tested at another local government, or it's been developed from scratch?
I don't think I've ever seen another local government use these sort of mechanisms. A lot of, you know, stuff is coming through in the medium density codes. So it's kind of stuff that's been talked about in the planning realm for maybe, 10, 15 years. It's just more of a formalization of that, I feel. So I don't think that there's probably not another model or another formal model that another local government uses. But as I said, it was sort of rigorously tested and, peer reviewed by independent consultants who are professionals in that area, architects, among the like. We also did some consultation with stakeholders like builders and local community members as well. So yeah, I think I don't want to say it's a first, but I think it's probably a first in the formalization of the way that this is done through a scheme requirement anyway. Yeah. Yep. We also do have a current local planning policy, but that's a development incentive policy. So we have a split coded area, which is a R2040 area. If you want to achieve the 40 or an R3040 area, if you want to achieve the 40, you have to basically use that sliding scale again, but that's enshrined in the local planning policy. So it's kind of been an ongoing testing process through that process. Yeah. Yep, the minister will need to approve these, but given that we've got support to advertise the provisions as they were, we feel pretty confident that the minister will give us the backing to have these implemented. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
The question was, were dwelling or roof colours looked at?
I think that's probably one of the things that's moved in the last 4 years. Maybe design trends have moved a little bit, but monument ColourBond sheds are all the rage at the moment for everyone to live in. So especially in Margaret River, if you drive through any of our rural residential areas, you'll pretty much see black boxes everywhere. They look great, but they're not so good from a sustainability point of view. So yeah, that's probably one of the areas that's moved a little bit, and we might look to move towards a solar absorption rate. We've kind of worked off, or the sustainability officers have advised that 0.6 is a pretty good marker for a solar absorption rate. So a solar absorption rate is the amount of sun or heat energy that a material will absorb and then hold, because that's one thing that affects the way that the dwelling works, is obviously how much heat it absorbs and then retains, and then that needs to be cooled. So darker colours will retain heat a lot faster than a lighter colour or refract light away. So yeah, we're definitely looking at that, and that might be V 2.0, and we'll see how these ones go. But yeah, definitely solar absorbance is a key factor that we'll look into in the future. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
No worries. Thanks.
Okay, we now have a slightly longer presentation with 3 presenters, I believe, from the City of Wanneroo. Yes. So the team here is Aaron Baxter, Carrie Gordon, and Craig Warnsborough. So the team works on district and local structure planning through the subdivision to development stages. Aaron's the senior land development engineer whose role is to oversee the civil engineering infrastructure is delivered by land developers. He's also a member on the IPWA Subdivision Guidelines Review Committee. We also have Carrie, the environmental officer with the City of Wanneroo. She's responsible for developer compliance with the environment management plans and also providing environmental advice on planning applications. Carrie's passionate about tree retention and is also a level 1 Bell assessor. Craig is the manager of land development at the City of Wanneroo, and he leads a team of civil engineers, landscape architects and environmental professionals to achieve the best possible development outcomes. Craig previously worked as an NRM officer and he's currently chairman and the Walga representative on the New Waterways Board. So welcome team, thank you. Just forward and back. Thank you.
Yeah, look, City of Wanneroo extends over a large area. We've got 32 kilometres of coastline. We run from Kandoola in the south all the way up to Two Rocks. We've got 3 new Metronet rail stations going in, and we've recently adopted it's the East Wanneroo District Structure Plan. So that is a massive area off to the east, and that's going to house approximately 150,000 people once it's fully built out. It's equivalent of about 5 Ellenbrooks. So Wanneroo is going through a period of just absolute manic growth at the moment, and trying to retain biodiversity and natural assets in that context is very difficult. So I just want to share a bit of our experience today and some of the challenges that you're going to face in a greenfields context. And we're doing it at the extreme end in terms of volume. So we're dealing with about 3,000 to 4,000 new lots a year being developed in our city. So it's absolutely massive. So one of the key messages I want to make is you need to be an expert generalist. So you've got planners in the room, we've got engineers. Do we? Any engineers? Just the one. Okay. Be nice to Aaron today. So we've got strategic, statutory planners, and how many environmental officers have we got? We've got a few enviros. Yeah, good. So I will touch on a bit on biodiversity. So I'll be preaching probably to the educated and converted. Look, as Veronica Wedgwood said, an educated person should know everything about something and something about everything. So as professionals in the land development field, whether it's planning, engineering, hydrology, environment, you need to have a bit of an understanding of other professions. I just wanted to reinforce that point, because if you're going to have influence on ground and try and achieve good environmental outcomes, you need to be able to speak other people's language and have a bit of an understanding about where they're coming from. So strive to be an expert generalist, and it will make you very employable as well. So that's a good thing. Biodiversity. So just to recap, it's the variability among living organisms from all sources, and it includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Eco-warrior. So a person actively involved in preventing damage to the environment. So you don't have to be a left-wing tree-hugging hippie. You can be a working professional like we are here today. Biodiversity hotspots. So a biographic region with significant levels of biodiversity that is threatened by human habitation. So across the globe, there are 36 biodiversity hotspots. And to qualify, you must have at least 1,500 vascular plants as endemics. So that means that they're not found anywhere else in that location. And you must have at least 30% or less of the original natural vegetation remaining. So it has to be under threat. So Southwest WA, we're one of 36. There are ones on the East Coast, and we are living in a magical part of Australia. Now, in terms of our biodiversity hotspot, almost 50% of Southwest Australia's 8,379 plant species are found nowhere else on the planet. I think that's absolutely amazing. But the big challenge confronting all of us in the room today, no matter what profession we're in, is how do we retain that biodiversity when we're in conflict? I guess in some ways we've got to deal with the state's imperative for development. Now, the big, political issue at the moment is homelessness and affordable housing. And that's really pushing that delivery of the McMansions and the cookie cutter urban development we're seeing across Perth Metro and Peel and across the regions. Now, a bit about soils. People forget about fungi. Fungi are great, and there's a huge diversity of fungi in the topsoil layer of our soils. That's just an example, a little snippet of what's actually within the ground itself. That's just the fruiting bodies, all the mycorrhizal fungal activity in the soil is hidden away. Ground covers. So Botany 101, there's a whole diversity of ground covers which add to our biodiversity in our natural vegetation. For the non-botanists in the room, this is going to be Botany 101 crash course. Myrtaceae is one of the most important family of plants in Southwest WA. You've got Eucalyptus, Corymbia, Leptospermum, Melaleuca genus, which make up that family. And there's 807 species of Myrtaceae. Half of them are endemic in Southwest WA. So it's absolutely amazing. They're absolutely beautiful. And we should be growing more of these in our public realm and also in our verges and in our gardens. Proteaceae, that's the next largest family of plants in Southwest WA. They're well adapted to our coastal plain soils, so our gutless sands, and they are just stunning. There's 681 species of Proteaceae, and 73% of those are endemic to Southwest WA. So it's absolutely incredible. They've got specialised root systems, and they just thrive on our coastal plain soils and also out in the regional areas as well. And all of that diversity, I guess, is represented in vegetation complexes. So a vegetation complex, that's been mapped for the entire southwest of the state by Heddle back in 1980 and also by Matiski in 2000. There's some great data sets, and that was touched on in one of the earlier presentations. It does need updating, but the veg complexes, they're derived from the assessment of soils, landform and rainfall. So all of those key things really determined, I guess, what complexes you have in a given location. And the vegetation complexes are based on, I guess, a series of plant communities which form regular repeating complexes, and it's linked to soil. So soil is really important. So you have to have an appreciation of geology. So in terms of Wanneroo's context and also parts of the other Swan Coastal Plain, you've got the Quindalup Veg Complex, which is our lovely beachside area. So you've got your coastal dunes. You move across into the Cottesloe Veg Complexes, which is all this beautiful coastal heath. The diversity in these areas is just phenomenal. And you can see the limestone bedrock underneath. No trees. So a lot of City of Wanneroo's coastal areas is made up of heath. So naturally, there's no trees in these locations. And so the challenge is to try and get urban forest into these locations which are being developed into housing estates. How do you do that when your geology doesn't actually allow for tree growth naturally? So there's some serious challenges there. You move across into the Karrakatta Veg Complex, which is your based on your yellow sands. You've got your Jarrah and Marri Forest. And then across to your white sands, which is your Bassendean Veg Complex. It's all your banks, your woodlands, absolutely stunning vegetation. And then as you get to the foothills, you've got your Southern River Veg Complex and your Guildford Veg Complex. And Andrew will be familiar with some of this type of vegetation, but there's not much left of it. And some of it's actually in Shire of SJ, which is probably some of the last remaining areas of that vegetation type. So the news is dire. So you just have a look at the media if you want to depress yourself. Biodiversity is being lost at a huge rate, and there's article after article. Biodiversity, extinction, quite depressing. If you want to depress yourself a little bit more, this is a really good documentary. Has anyone actually seen this one? 1 Million Acres a Year. It is well worth watching. That's your Friday night, okay? Andrew touched on 1950s in Perth, and a lot changed in the 1950s. There was this massive growth period post-war. And what happened in Southwest WA was just a massive loss in biodiversity across our biodiversity hotspot region. Farmers were forced to clear massive areas of land for agricultural use, and they had to do it or else they'd potentially lose their land titles. So there was this massive scale loss of biodiversity, and this documentary takes you through that journey. It's absolutely mind-blowing, the loss. But what's that got to do with urban development? Well, if you look at Southwest WA and the biodiversity hotspot that we are, basically everything that's in yellow is cleared land, the red is urban form, and the last little bits of green, that's your native vegetation. So this map's a little bit old, so it's probably deteriorated even more since this was prepared. But it just goes to show how much loss there has been across Southwest WA. So what? Well, the urban landscape is doing the same. We are losing biodiversity at a massive scale. We're creating a biological desert. And you just have to look at the average urban development, whether it's down south or up north. It is creating a biological desert on a huge scale. And Aaron will touch on, I guess, the engineering constraints that lead to this kind of outcome. But this is Ellervale up in Eglinton. You can see on the sign, nestled into nature. There's not much nature left by the time it's been developed. I've got to acknowledge the Perth Biodiversity Project. So this was commenced in 2001 by WELGA. This was fantastic. A lot of really good data sets came out of this. It helped inform the local biodiversity strategies and plans that most local governments have these days. There's some fantastic data sets, but get familiar with these documents. So whether you're an engineer, a planner, strategic or stat, or you're involved in land development, you really should have a good understanding of what remains in your local government area. And of course, the mapping, I mean, you look at the percentage of vegetation complexes remaining across the Swan Coastal Plain, it does look dire. I mean, there's quite a few veg complexes listed where you've got less than 10% representation remaining. So look at it from what is actually within secured reserves, and that figure gets even worse. So there is a need to really try and retain what we can at every stage of planning, right through to the subdivision stage, and that's where it gets very tricky. You really need to start planning for the stuff at strategic level, that regional and strategic level. Trying to deal with it at the back end of subdivision, yeah, it gets very difficult, it gets tiring, and we'll show you some of the case studies shortly. Stuart and Banksia woodlands. Stuart woodlands are now critically endangered. Banksia woodlands are endangered. So it is dire. These woodland systems are found right across the Swan Coastal Plain. We need to do whatever we can to try and retain this vegetation. Understory vegetation. Often developers don't see the value of understory. The number of times I hear the term, it's just scrub, it just blows my mind. And that's where all your biodiversity is. So your understory is key. The trees, yep, developers love to retain trees, but when it comes to the understory, they're just not interested. And it makes it very challenging to try and retain that biodiversity when you're having to educate continuously and fight to keep understory. And there's some great examples which Carrie will run through shortly, where we had to fight hard just to keep the understory in a public open space. But the extent of land clearing. So we pulled some data. We're clearing roughly across the city of Wanneroo about 1,400 hectares a year inland. So we're losing a lot of that coastal heath up in the Northwest Corridor. It's just a phenomenal amount of loss of biodiversity. The Spearwood Dune system, now that runs from City of Wanneroo right through to Moore River. It's a transition zone. So the biodiversity, the genetic biodiversity is absolutely amazing. It's coastal heath, and it's vegetation that's on the extremes of its range. So you get this genetic diversity, and you get this beautiful diversity of plant species as well through that area. So it's an amazing bit of the world. Now, I just want to touch on clearing permits. Now, this is a bit of gold. Clearing permit issued under the Environmental Protection Act 1986 or under the EPBC Act 1999, so the Commonwealth legislation, doesn't override the requirement to retain vegetation as part of a WAPC subdivision approval or development approval granted under the Planning and Development Act. We have regular conversations with developers and consultants who say, well, we can clear whatever vegetation we want across our subdivision because we've got state or federal approval to do so. It's like, well, hold on a minute. You've also got requirements under the P&D Act and your subdivision conditions to actually retain what the local government considers important. So make sure you don't fall for that one. So a local government, through its subby conditions that are imposed by WAPC on the subby approval, may require a subdivider or developer to retain veg not impacted by subdivision or development works. So that's a key message. The legislation works in tandem, so one bit of legislation doesn't trump the other one. Okay, so applicant must take all possible measures to ensure vegetation identified for protection by the local government is actually retained on site. So don't let consultants or a developer try and convince you otherwise. Water is important. Now, water seems to drive a lot of the landscape outcomes. And when we saw that with Shire of SJ, with the multi-use corridors, that greenway link going through Byford, and that's all driven by water. In our corridor, it's not the flow of water, but it's the lack of groundwater availability that's driving a lot of our environmental outcomes. We have the Northwest Corridor water supply strategy. It basically limits the amount of water we can use on our public open space. We have licenses for 6,750 kilolitres a hectare compared to 7,500 kilolitres a hectare, which is quite extreme. It means when parks are handed over to the City of Wanneroo after the 2-year maintenance period, we do not have a licence to irrigate garden beds. So it means it has a huge impact on how we maintain our public open space. And so that really drives the need to retain natural vegetation. It also encourages water-sensitive urban design and also the optimisation of how we manage drainage within our public open space. So we want to minimise the clearing of vegetation in POS so that we can actually just manage the natural vegetation that was originally there. Landform. The landform is hard to keep. Everything is cut and filled. So if ever you drive up the Northwest Corridor, you'll see sand being taken from a hillside and then used to fill a hole somewhere else. And that's to minimise the cost of importing material. But if you can retain landforming, you get some fantastic outcomes. If you keep the landform, you can keep the biodiversity. Landform makes your estates unique. Does anyone live in Floreat? Roscommon Park, if you ever visit Floreat, check out this public open space. It's a remnant sand dune, which just sits amongst the urban form there. And it's a window into once was. So the residents love this public open space. Absolutely stunning. And it's very low maintenance. I mean, it's natural vegetation. It's fantastic. And it's self-sustaining. So it's not just scrub. So retaining biodiversity is a big challenge. We're dealing with a diverse set of stakeholders, developers, consultants. They've all got different interests, motivations, and constraints. And it makes it very hard to try and achieve a balanced outcome. And so the role of the professional local government is to really strive to get a balance across the social, economic, environmental domains and try and get a decent outcome rather than some Frankenstein outcome, which occasionally you see. But each of those groups are working within their own remit, and it's up to local government in many instances to try and get a balanced outcome. The opportunity, well, collaboration is key. So you need to become a really good collaborator, whether you're an engineer, a planner, hydrologist, an environmental consultant. You need to be able to collaborate and you need to be able to negotiate really well. So there's some very important interpersonal skills to have if you want to be able to retain biodiversity and achieve good outcomes. So we'll have a look at some case studies. We'll look at how we've optimised drainage within public open space to try and retain bushland. We'll look at some of the losses we've had as well. So we've had some good wins, we've also had some good losses, some really bad losses. But it is challenging, it is hard. And I'll hand over to Carrie, who'll guide us through some really interesting case studies.
Craig. Yes, so basically we've had a few wins and losses, as Craig mentioned. McGiffin Park in Eglinton is the first example. It's a bit hard to see there. It's just basically just underneath Seaburn Way. And you can see it's that rectangular portion of vegetation above McGiffin Ave there and below Stayburn Way. It's a bit of Banksia woodland. So it's obviously pretty diverse. It's also Cottesloe Complex Central and South, which according to our LBP or Local Biodiversity Plan is a high priority for retention. Obviously, we'd love for it to be viable, which means that it can basically function into the future, ecologically maintain biodiversity, and basically survive all the external pressures moving in towards it into the long term or into the future, into the next generation. But as you can see, we don't always get that outcome, but I think we still get an okay outcome. We do prefer it to be over a hectare if possible. But then also we have issues with those sorts of areas then becoming classifiable vegetation. And then you have to look at those sorts of things as well. As it is, these patches of vegetation that were retained were considered anyway in terms of BAL assessments. So as you'll see from the progressive slides, that has a huge impact on what gets retained at the end as well. So again, we've got drainage on the left, we've got some retention on the right. This is basically a run through. You can see each of the areas developing. You've got a bit of passive open space in the middle. As Craig mentioned, under the Northwest Corridor water strategy, we can basically only irrigate about a third of POS for turf. So retention of vegetation really achieves a good environmental outcome with regards to water use. We have external pressures from battering, so earthworking to get your road levels. As I mentioned before, we also have BAL requirements. So a lot of the clearing on the edges is worked to achieve a suitable BAL of 29 or less on those adjoining or opposite residences. Something that we've learnt over time is that generally your road reserve widths are around 14 metres wide, but adjacent to POS, road reserves can actually be reduced much more than that. That obviously decreases your separation between the bush or the retained vegetation and your residents, which then means that developers are more inclined to clear that to achieve their BAL requirements. Because at the end of the day, if they don't achieve BAL 29, they can't subdivide that land. And if that BAL 29 is obviously applied to those houses, those residences have to put in more building standards and specifications to allow them to build in that area. So there's obviously a cost involved in that as well. So that's it over time. The edges were revegetated. That's another barrier that we have as well, is that sometimes they put in low threat vegetation. We've just got to make sure that we're onto them, because we want to make sure that what they put in those re-veg areas are still going to be replicating what was there. So we've got a good outcome biodiversity wise, but probably a pretty good outcome. We've got a pretty good mix of areas there. Probably around 0.3 of a hectare has been retained, plus the revegetation area. So it's not bad in our opinion. There's a bit of pictures of the swale and of course the playground area. We've got carnavies actually perching on the posts of the trees waiting for everything to grow, because that's actually re-vegged carnaby species. So maybe they know, I don't know, but they're there waiting anyway. That's just a picture of it walking along the path on the inside. And then there's obviously a sort of conceptual picture from the outside showing how it fits. We've got another conservation reserve to the left there, which it sort of acts as a bit of a stepping stone or a corridor, I guess, for biodiversity. So even though it's small, it kind of adds value and has value because it is quite close to that other area and can act as a bit of a stepping stone, especially for flying organisms. But yeah, hopefully a little bit of seed recruitment and movement and that sort of thing will also occur. As I mentioned before, this is the bow side of things. So adjacent lots are required to be bow 29 or less. We also have the clearing for the swale. But obviously we'd like to retain more vegetation, but that's something that couldn't be achieved. Something to note is also that if the vegetation had been on the left-hand side of the public open space, there's nested lots there. So again, we'd have to consider bow considerations and separation between the residences and the vegetation being retained. And then what happens in that space in terms of usability is a sort of a question that we have to answer because it's sort of no man's land, if so to speak. So yeah, basically we just have to consider or get the applicants to consider design when they're retaining vegetation. The next one is Kennerton Park. This is in Lansdale. This is okay, so it's just under Andromeda Loop, just go right, number 8. So it was quite a nice patch of bush before it was cleared mainly. It's actually Bassendean complex, central and south. It's a high to critical priority in accordance with our local biodiversity plan. That means that it's less than 30% extent remaining in the region, less than 10% locally remaining, and less than that in reserves. So it's getting pretty dire. There's been a few impacts from unauthorised access and stuff like that over time. You've got your impacts from road construction, as you can see, and the portion up the top is actually to achieve bow ratings, the bit, sort of the diagonal bit for those homes to the north. And that is the design at the end. So we got probably not an amazing amount being retained, but the good thing about this is also the area on the right is already managed by the city, and it's for conservation. It's around 0.9 of a hectare. So collectively, both portions sort of equal a hectare or just over a hectare. So in terms of viability, we're looking better there. Obviously some of the obstacles, as I said before, is revegetation with correct species. We had a few issues with Geraldton wax being planted as re-veg, and a few other species that are considered weeds in the environmental world. So we had a few issues with those that got ironed out. Something that was also really good with this one, it's quite, to give you some context, it's quite hilly there. So basically it goes from the high point up at Andromeda Loop down to a low point in Simbroom Circuit. They managed to actually retain some chewits down the bottom in drainage, which you can see at the back there. So their levels, like it's a roadside drain, and it just like falls quite a fair way down and retains those chewits, which is amazing. As you can see though, retaining native vegetation, you've got that instant landscape amenity. You've got shade already. If you walk through there, you can already feel and hear all the birds and everything moving through it. So it's really nice to be out there in amongst it. And there's just a few other pictures. And there's the bow assessment and showing you how the vegetation impacts those homes. So they were about 29 because they were able to set back those homes in accordance with the R codes to make sure the buildings weren't within the BAU 40 range. So yeah, basically, you know, we prefer them to consider road reserve widths being wider, but that's what happening there. This is Picasso Park. This is in Alkimos. I don't know if we've got a picture. Oh, we don't. But I'm not sure if you're aware, but Wanneroo has another obstacle with regards to vegetation retention, and that's UXO. Department of Defence has done obviously a number of activities in the past, and there's unexploded ordnance through a portion of our northern suburbs. To mitigate the risk, developers have to do ground surveys, which involves clearing 2 metre rows or 2 metre wide blocks of land every 10 metres. And that includes POS areas obviously as well. So as you can imagine, it's a grid-like clearing process, and unfortunately I don't have it on this aerial, but that also impacts vegetation retention because obviously then you have unauthorised access issues, people use those tracks, it degrades further, there's less left, more edge effects, the weeds get in, all the rest of it. So that's something else that we need to deal with. And Alkimos, Eglinton, Two Rocks and Yanchep all have those sorts of issues as well. In this one, Picasso Park, as you saw in the previous slide, and into this one, has retained a little bit of vegetation, Banksia woodland as well. We had to fight to get this retained and work with the consultants to modify the drainage so then they could retain that. Otherwise, they were going to have to cut that to achieve their levels. So basically, normally we allow, 1.2 metre?
1.2 metre maximum flood storage depth. So and that's typical across most local governments. Here, to achieve that 1.2 metre flood storage depth, they would have had to have filled in that low point in the park, which is where all the biodiversity is. And so we actually made a conscious effort to vary that depth criteria to 1.7 metres. And the trade-off was we kept biodiversity. So there's always trade-offs, and you've got to be willing to do that.
So that was a pretty good outcome. So, and it looks amazing, as you can see by the picture. And all of these examples were retaining not just the trees, but what's underneath as well. So all the understory. Fontana Park in Alkimos. This was their original design concept. So when you look at the next photos, keep that in mind. They wanted this sort of European design outcome, lots of turf and sort of formal tracks and stuff. I think that was their intent, something like that. So this is a part of the area, and as I'll go through, you'll be able to see. So it's actually it actually had 3 vegetation complexes through it, which is awesome. Means it's more biodiverse than certain other areas, because obviously you've got you know, different types of species within each of those zones. It's a picture from the inside. Yep. Just quickly, this is a bit of the pressures from the outside. So you've got earthworks issues. And then what can go wrong? So basically, you probably can't see it, or you might be able to see it. Unfortunately, they did all the fencing. They fenced it all off with temporary flagging, so it was quite obvious. One of their consultants went in and did grass tree translocations. So they went in and harvested about 40 to 50 grass trees and obviously wrecked all the vegetation underneath. So they had to go back in and revegetate that. Obviously, the grass trees can't be put back in because they need irrigating. But it just goes to show that despite our best efforts, we still have things that go wrong. So the developer was aware, the consultants were aware, but the contractors went in, just was miscommunication, and we just had just had that sort of thing happen. So that's what ended up happening. So still a really good amount of vegetation retained. And I'll pass you over to,
I was just going to mention, the limestone geology, we actually kept in Fontana Park.
Oh, we
used as a
did.
Feature, so that was quite a good outcome, and actually shows you how the
Okay.
vegetation is linked to the geology underneath. So yeah, really good design.
Hi, usually, or I've previously given this talk to engineers, and it's about basically why land development engineers are bitter, cynical, depressed, and skeptical. And one of the major reasons for the inability to retain trees on any given subdivisional site, especially the large greenfield site, is of course bulk earthworks. As Coralie previously mentioned about the new planning system, it seems to have echoed a lot of things that I learned about 20 years ago down in Mandurah. And at that time, Graham Hill and John Harris would actually bring in developers and their consulting, town planners prior to structure plan stage, and areas would already be identified, trees would have already been marked, and regardless of whether the developer wanted their POS on the top of it, well, basically at the bottom of the hill where your drainage is going to go, it was then identified that this was worth keeping, and if it's at the top of the hill, that's where your POS is going to go. So, City of Wanneroo, basically, as you're aware, you can do clearing on two ways, under a DA or subdivision approval. We would prefer that it's all done under a subdivision approval so you can actually condition it up. As Stephen was saying about McMansions, the other driving factor is what's always gets called the industry. And builders and developers, it's so much easier to create everything flat. There's no topography, and builders, apparently architects, don't know what a step, sunken lounge is anymore. Right. And additionally, there's also the density issues, and every once in a while you get site-specific applications. Service stations, trucks don't want to roll over, and apparently kids in schools nowadays don't know how to use steps, so everything's got to be flat. Prior to earthworks, we like to actually identify what trees are going to stay. Now, this is actually where the land development engineer becomes a little bit cynical, because you will get a VFMP or some form of documentation from a professional, and hello. Yes, so you get documentation basically identifying what flora and fauna is there. It behooves the local government employee to actually find out if that is accurate. Additionally, it's always a good idea to go out on site and actually see what they have seen and identify and think for yourself, is it worth being retained? And of course, it needs to be, once identified, you need to actually secure it. Now, I've seen all sorts of things from people going around with pink cans of spray paint, plastic tape. Ideally, it really should be bunted off and fenced. The other limitations for good design is basically your services. And in the last couple of years, ever since COVID, things have seemed to have changed. The authorities that you expect to follow their own design criteria and specifications, they seem to have become a little bit more lax and forgiving to the developers and not holding to the rigour that they should be. But ultimately, your levels on most subdivisional sites are governed by two factors. It's your water and primarily sewer, and it's because of that beautiful thing, gravity. As my year 8 physics teacher once told me, gravity, not just a good idea, it's the law. And that is about the same amount of laughs as he got 40 years ago. Right. When you identify trees that are going to be kept, it's too easy for designers to basically just do a grid. Everything needs to be straight. Now, admittedly, there are safety factors on your higher order roads, whether it's going to be volume or velocity, speed. Trees in the middle of the road, possibly not the best idea, especially if you're trying to cram it into a 20-metre road reserve. However, on your lower order roads, your access Ds and Cs, you can actually meander the road around if the tree's worth being. Additionally, if trees are in verges, chuck the service onto the other side. We've actually seen, you can do a U-shape, go around the tree, come back on the other side. And not ideal, but if you really, really need to, bore your services. What else we got? Oh yeah, vegetation pickup. So this goes back to my previous thing about the VFMP coming in. Craig's already touched on the significant understory and that it's not just scrub. It provides all sorts of habitat for other living things, geckos and bobcats, bobtail lizards. Sorry, I know what I mean. Right, so this actually was a photo of a subdivision down in Rockingham, and it was something with a bit of consternation. It was one tree. It was where Mr. Italiano proposed to his wife, 120 years ago. They were the first settlers in Rockingham, or Baldivis in particular. This tree had to be kept. So we did what we said we would do. We identified it. It was masked up with a nice big chunk of pink tape, identifying that it was to be retained. The road was designed to go around it. See, it's there somewhere. No, it isn't. Never underestimate the enthusiasm of a 19-year-old in a D9. So everything that we tried to do, it was explained, it needed to be there. So this is where policing of your officers need to be out on site and just watching all this stuff all the time. But admittedly, sometimes this stuff does. It works. We've maintained and retained all the trees in a chunk of road down in central Wanneroo, and the outcome has been excellent. Again, Catalina Green, another place in Clarkson, identified the trees early on, and they were allowed to be incorporated into both the streetscape, front verges and POS. Capricorn, trees in the middle of the road. Again, although this is actually signposted as a 50-kilometre-an-hour road, we were allowed, it had a wider road reserve, and thus they were allowed to be, the alignment, the actual centre line, has actually been shifted off to the side to accommodate it. So there are design outcomes. Stormwater. Okay, so POS areas, we all know that they now provide a function of, stormwater drainage. Sometimes the basins are unacceptably large, and that's because of some design constraints that are just not really considered. City of Wanneroo previously had an infiltration rate of 1 metre to 3 metres early on, and it was coming up with, this was actually back in the day where they had sumps. And what that was meaning was is that we were getting these unusually large basins. In actual fact, at Picasso Park, the hydrology of that site was over 40 metres a day. So there's no reason why you should be using an infiltration rate so low. I think in the end, we actually used 10 metres a day on that. Additionally, you can also, when designing your stormwater system, try and get all your stormwater back to water sensitive urban design principles. Try and get stormwater infiltrate as high up into the catchment as possible. In this way, you can do it with bottomless pits or rain gardens, verge-side swales. The less stuff that gets into the pipe system is always going to be less that actually gets discharged out in your POS. Verge garden, so that's an example in Wangara. Graceful Boulevard, so that's your inverted swale in the middle of the road. tree pits.
Actually,
If you've got, a good maintenance crew, they'll love these. Yeah, this was actually down in Lakelands, and this was what I was saying about, with the city of Mandurah. They were very early on. This was around, Black Swan Lake. It's actually very interesting. You can actually see up until about 2007, where the average lot down there was around 580 square metres. Big remnant chewits and jarrahs were actually left out the front of people's houses, and they were under the, people went and bought the house under the proviso that that tree was to stay. If they wanted it gone, they had to do it. And some of these trees, the removal cost was like $20,000. So subsequently, they spent that money on actually designing a house that incorporated the retention of the tree. And that's it now, but you can actually see there's the trees kept in the parks, the trees kept in the roadway, the rail corridor has now gone through, but you can see where it's gone from the larger houses to the smaller houses. I think they were like, this was the beginning of the flute lots, the 180 square metre lots where nothing can be kept. Anyway, I'll give you back to Craig.
So, look, just to sum up, the obstacles are huge. So I've listed there what you typically have to deal with through the land subdivision process. The big one at the moment is the political environment. So homelessness and affordable housing is one of the big drivers for delivering cookie cutter outcomes. There's all the constraints that we've talked about in the presentation. One of the big issues is consultant reports. There's admissions, inconsistencies with on-ground reality, and copy and paste jobs. The number of times I see a City of Kwinana reference in a City of Wanneroo report is just amazing. So just be mindful of that. And communication is key. But oh my God, yeah, that's a lot to deal with. How to overcome it? Well, have a ferocious curiosity, be an expert generalist, make sure you've got a damn good team around you. Structure planning is key, so that broad scale planning is important, so that way you get those regional outcomes. Trying to do biodiversity conservation at a local scale is very challenging. You can see, you do get limited outcomes in some circumstances. Restricting clearing and bulk earthworks via the DA process. The risk is if they do it via a DA and there's no subby approval, they may shift the location of the POS. And so the areas that you retained under the DA potentially get cleared and turned into housing, and areas that were cleared under the DA potentially become public open space. So making sure that you do bulk earthworks and clearing through a subby process is more preferable than a DA process. And we touched on UXO. Non-invasive technology like drone technology is potentially available now. And make sure your environmental officers are attending startup meetings for subby works. The benefits, well, mental health and wellbeing. COVID-19 demonstrated how important natural areas were, and there was a huge demand increase for natural areas, nature play during COVID. But the big thing is, you're achieving biodiversity in the public realm, which provides connection to the landscape and that sense of place. So I think that's very important. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron, Craig and Carrie. A great presentation with some really useful examples. I'm going to hold questions until the end of the session. Just watch that cord there that I've put in everyone's way. Okay, our last speaker of the session is now Renata Zelenova, who works with us here at Wolga on the local biodiversity project that has recommenced in a new form. So Renata has been with Wolga for 14 years. She previously managed the local biodiversity project for the sector until 2014. This was an award-winning program that, as Craig mentioned, led to the development of many biodiversity strategies for local governments. The project also led to the development of standardised methods for natural area assessment and prioritisation. So today, Renata will talk about a new project that is building upon this previous work and the tools available to support the consideration of biodiversity in land use planning. Thanks, Renata.
Thank you, and I'm very conscious that standing between you and the lunch, so I'll try to speed it up. Many of you, good. Many of you might have known me for a while now, so this is a, yeah, it is mine. Yeah, it's all good. So I'll start. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners or custodians of the lands that we are on and our online participants are on, and acknowledge their relationship with the land and with that relationship, how they managed it and what we inherited and can witness still. I'll go briefly provide a touch up on some of the aspects that were covered today, but put in the context where we are at now and why we are at this stage in local biodiversity conservation planning. And then talk about some of the existing supports and resources that are still available to local governments, even though we don't have a fully funded program to support local biodiversity conservation through WOLGA. So I'll skip this one. It's very much relates, all the work and the program and the support relates to all the functions that local governments play in relationships and how their activities interact with biodiversity. And in many of these roles, there is a direct interaction with the legislation, environmental legislation, but as it was demonstrated, through the previous presentations, there is such an important role of local government as a facilitator and actually encouraging and changing behavior or human interactions with the biodiversity at the local level, even just through facilitating and supporting volunteers that do so much work at the managing of the assets. But we are mostly talking about trying to influence changes and retention of biodiversity at local level. So where it comes from, the concept of local bushland was introduced back in 1995, because previously, as Andrew has pointed out, there was this concept, yeah, we need to retain biodiversity, we need to retain natural areas, but it was these big reserves, national parks, conservation reserves managed by the state. So it wasn't until 1995 there was this recognition that we actually need to retain some areas locally. Then in 2000, there was a whole of a government initiative for bushland in Perth, on the Swan Coastal Plain portion of Perth. And that one actually, reinstated or provided further support for the need to retain biodiversity locally, so local reserves. In recognition that to maintain biodiversity in those not large conservation estates, you actually need to provide for connectivity, and those local reserves do provide for that. However, there was no guidance provided as to how do we identify what's locally significant, and that comes to some of the issues that were pointed out in the last presentation is how do you negotiate which bit is important and which one is not, and which one should be kept. So in response to that, as a local government initiative with some funding through NRM grants, WOLGA has supported the Perth Biodiversity Project, which then extended, the methodology was extended to the Southwest through the Southwest Biodiversity Project based in Bunbury. And then it transitioned into, called it a local biodiversity program, because we were trying to, and we're expanding to other areas. So worked with the City of Albany and City of Greater Geraldton as well, and some regional local governments like the Shire of Northern, Shire of Chittering. So it wasn't only about urban bushland, it was about local bushland, assisting local governments with retaining and managing, considering biodiversity in a strategic way. Then after we were, the funding programs, the state NRM or the Commonwealth
NRM funding models have changed significantly, and there was a limited opportunity to gain funding support to continue with the program as it was established. However, Volga was continued its support through running some of the events that deliver or support local governments in how to consider biodiversity at the local level through the environmental events. And then for a number of years, Volga provided an online mapping tool that provided access to information, especially for those local governments that don't have that internal capacity. And then we seized an opportunity that the State NRM program has provided a new set of funding for strategic projects. So Volga applied and was successful in end of last year, to run we call it a local biodiversity and native vegetation management project. It's a very short-term project, but it includes a component of devolved grants of $300,000 to local governments for specific projects. And I will talk a little bit about those. But I also want to go back, what actually happened in the meantime? So I said at the beginning, yeah, there was suddenly this recognition there is a need to protect biodiversity. The Perth Biodiversity Project developed and published a local government biodiversity planning guidelines in 2004. Some local governments have started and developed their first local biodiversity strategies, but there was this uncertainty. And so what? How will the state government consider what these local biodiversity strategies are saying? Will they, if we make a decision based on that, will that decision be supported? So it took a couple of years, and this was despite the initial, when the guidelines were published, Volga had letters of support from the Office of the EPA and what was then Department of Environment, supporting and endorsing the methodology encouraged and described in the guidelines. Then in 2006, the EPA guidance statement number 33, which provides guidance on how to consider environmental matters in planning, provides a direct reference to the guidelines, and again acknowledges that, yes, the guidance statement sets out criteria for how to identify regionally significant natural areas, but it also talks about that it acknowledges that it's important to retain locally significant areas at the local scale. So that's another confirmation. Then in 2010, there was always this, so how is the planning department going to take decisions that refer to local biodiversity strategies? And the Planning Commission at their meeting back in 2010 concluded that while they won't be endorsing individual local biodiversity strategies, they will endorse local biodiversity conservation objectives through if they were integrated into local planning strategies. And that's why it was so good to hear today. Andrew emphasized it, the important role of local planning strategies. And yes, there is always a requirement in the model scheme text, what information should you put in there that identify important natural areas. But how do you, what else there is? So actually local biodiversity strategy provides you that process, that methodology to prioritize those natural areas across local government. And then in 2010, that was a big year, there was another important decision which really set the tone for and got we've got the encouragement that the process, the methodology that local biodiversity strategies developed following the methodology developed for Volga it's worth pursuing and following the process. Is there was a set decision on a subdivision and decision by a Shire of Chittering, and also that was supported by the Planning Commission to refuse a subdivision on a land, and said while it was upheld by SET on planning matters, but it made an important comment that even a draft local biodiversity strategy was a valid planning consideration in decision-making on that particular proposal. So it was a valid planning consideration for local government to make. And that gave the weight and the value of demonstrated the value of these documents. So since then, number of local governments have undertaken the process, and then it resulted in, back in 2015, many of you would recall in local planning schemes, we had public open space classification, and most of it was or recreational local reserves. There wasn't a recognition of bushland areas, significant bushland areas, local reserves, preserved or retained through public open space. It was the city of Wanneroo that actually tried to get it, and it took them about 4 years to get in a classification of conservation reserve, conservation recreation reserve into their local planning scheme. So that was 4 years. And then in 2015, now we have an environmental conservation in the local planning scheme classification as an option for public open space. And I feel that that's another signal that indicates that there is a recognition for the importance of local bushland. So, and this is what it looks like. So here are, since then, there were 8 local governments that had developed local biodiversity strategies that have introduced this conservation and reservation into their schemes, local planning schemes. And you can see in the metropolitan region scheme, you have residential urban zoning, but within that, there are some conservation reserves. So they do play a role and they do have an impact. But by this project, since the program felt that there were all these tools were developed, but of course things change, legislation changes, provision changes. We learned lots of lessons over the years while developing or working with local governments, developing local biodiversity strategies. So how can there was a need to update some of the tools and resources that were previously provided. And we thought this was an opportunity with the grant to do that. And I use this photo. I hope the ladies from the Shire of Esperance are still online with us. This is what we need. We need to have people that have the skills, do know their local area. So here are 2 ladies that discovered a new species in a road reserve, doing their routine work assessments in assessing local vegetation in a road reserves for an road upgrade. So can we get more staff that the work they are doing is easier to do because the resources are often limited. So I don't know what happened there, but I have 2 titles left. The project, the funding for the project, what it involves development of some update of some of the resources, specifically update to the guidelines on local biodiversity conservation planning. There are still to be published, but getting there. NIA templates. So this is a template that's used by local governments to assess natural areas, collect basic ecological data, and that is then used for various purposes. Provide training, roadside vegetation assessment. Then we have the devolved grants for local governments. We finished with round 1. There are 11 local governments that will be delivering project with the funding, and we are announcing a second round. So I'll talk about that later. And there are 3 types of activities that are being funded. The funding is to allow local governments to undertake the initial ecological assessments for the reserves or roadsides, prepare a local biodiversity strategy, or to prepare a local policy, a local planning policy, or local policy or code of conduct, internal policy for consideration of biodiversity. So the local government biodiversity planning guidelines update. This is building on the over 10 years of local governments developing local biodiversity strategies. We learned what works, what doesn't, what are the key features that a local biodiversity strategy should include to be effective in influencing or for a local government being able to use it to support their decision-making, whether to inform the land use planning or actually following through informing the prioritization for management of reserves. So local biodiversity strategies focus on local natural areas. That's not only land that's vested in local governments, it's all land, it's private land, includes private land. Only land that's excluded is DBCA managed lands. And in the metropolitan region, it used to be bush forest areas, but many of those sites are actually managed by local government. So there is some are included. They need to have objectives and targets, because unless you decide, you work those out, it's really hard to argue why certain areas you need to protect. And I'm reminded of, there was an example, sorry, with the city of Wanneroo putting on this in the spotlight, but back in Banksia Grove, there was a large area of beautiful Banksia woodland that was subdivided. And it was and back then the environmental officer argued using the local biodiversity strategy that to retain 9 hectares of that Banksia woodland in public open space within that subdivision. And without that, it was really difficult to demonstrate that why we need to do it here, because the argument was, oh, there's plenty of Banksia woodland left elsewhere. We don't have to do it there, but they actually, it was using the strategy proved effective there. There was still a discussion about viability, because it said it should be viable. So what is viable? We need to define, or have to be clear what we talk about or what we consider viable for each vegetation type. It's critical that we include a bushland protection map. So you actually show, it's not enough to show where the values are. It's important to identify areas that are, whether you want to call them hotspots of regulatory priority or areas for that meet your targets, they need to be mapped spatially. And an action plan. And it includes all areas. It's not a matter for the environmental officer to implement this. This needs to be a whole of a local government responsibility. So it provides an overview of typical steps and all the parts of the local biodiversity strategy. Initially, as I mentioned, yeah, you have to have involved your planning staff, your environmental staff, assets, infrastructure managers for the strategy to be effective. The updated guidelines provide a list of spatial data sets that are readily available to local governments and also options. One of the things that we have learned, even though the first guidelines and the prioritization criteria were developed for Perth and later for the parts of Southwest, over the years, we've been able to demonstrate that they can be extended to other parts of the state, and you can actually combine data. So you have local governments that don't use vegetation complexes are used as a surrogate for ecological communities. You can use other information where that's not available. Benefits, it's a catalyst for early consideration of biodiversity in land use planning and also in planning for your projects, and increases transparency on what's significant locally, because often local planning schemes will have provisions to protect significant vegetation. What is significant? You don't want to be deciding it on project by project basis. It's good to have that regional context to support the arguments. Have the local protection targets, and also what we have found, been able to demonstrate through the project, that by implementing local biodiversity strategies, you can actually improve the status of biodiversity in a regional context. So it's not that it does have a effect at the broader scale. And there are many other benefits, but I'm running out of time, so I'll just focus on the other one. The natural area initial assessment templates, these were developed to assist local governments when local governments will have over 200 reserves to manage. You would unlikely that you would get enough money to do a management plan for every one of those reserves, but they need to be somehow considered. The investment or the resources for managing the threats need to be divided. How do you do that? So these templates were developed to provide that quick assessment of key ecological considerations, characteristics of a site, key threats, vegetation condition, and some other criteria that can be used then to assess and compare relative importance of these areas and make a decision for whether it's for increased protection or management investment. So they are designed to be for assessment of natural areas, so bushland, wetlands, rock outcrops, coastal dunes, not that suitable for waterways, but there is a new really good template available that can be used for riparian vegetation. They are used not only to inform the management of areas that are vested in local government, they can be used, for example, if you apply, some local governments do have local planning policies for biodiversity conservation that they apply on they use it to protect vegetation on private land. So we can use the templates to do the basic assessment of the vegetation on private land to support the decisions on how the design or development application goes. And so with the 2023 NAIA templates that are ready to be released, there are still the 4 parts. And the reason for that was in 2018, we have asked local governments what they, because many have used the templates, what are the changes they would like to see, how effective they found the templates to be. There was some discussion around whether there need to be that much information collated. There was concern over the summary, the prioritization of the process, because the system, how it was set up, often resulted in more than half of your reserves being important, having the highest score. So what do you do next? So we try to introduce some numerical scoring in there to enable a finer scale prioritization. So the new templates include a new summary, which is previous templates were quite specific to the Perth and the Southwest. This is designed to be able to be used from Geraldton across the Wheat Belt to the Southwest to Esperance. And you will see there is a numerical scoring, and it's set up in a way that will clearly separate your local and locally significant areas and those that meet the regional significance criteria. And there are guides and references. One of the other things that was pointed out that what local governments were needing to help them to prioritize areas reserves for management was to assess the community values. Well, it was considered whether to include it or not. At the end, it's not included, but there are examples. That's a way that can be done easily added to once you use the ecological once you use the NAIA templates for the ecological assessment. So the decision was made that will be the simpler way. Keep it as it is. It's consistent with what was done before, and so we can actually do comparisons with previous assessments and record any changes, trends. Now, the round 2 of the devolved grants. After the round 1, we've got around just over $60,000 left. So we thought, let's do another round for some projects, hopefully that can be delivered. There are 2 types of activities. One is ecological assessment for local government lands. There is up to $10,000 per local government you can apply. These money are to support the employment of a local government officer to collect the data using the NIA templates or other formats to collect the information for the reserves. It's important for those of you that are not familiar with the NIA templates. This is not full-blown flora surveys. So there was a bit of a concern when it was initially announced that, oh, 10,000, it will not give us much, not when you employ a consultant to do a flora survey, but this is using the templates to collect the basic information. And the important component in here is to actually increase the capacity, internal capacity of local government staff to undertake this type of works. So we use it as an opportunity for training and community engagement because there are many volunteers that do know the local areas and they can actually undertake this work. So it's the ecological assessment of reserves and roadsides. I'll skip that. I'm happy to talk to anyone about those. And the other one is development and adoption of local planning policy on native vegetation and biodiversity. It's again up to $10,000 per project. In the previous round, we had 1 local government that applied for this. They are going to develop a local planning policy on tree protection. So it's an opportunity. There is a set of assessment criteria that are described in the guidelines. There are some general conditions. The key one is that there is an expectation that local governments contribute 50% to the cost, whether it's cash or in kind, to the delivery of the project. And if possible, keep to the caps, but we are flexible in where we can justify that if it's a little bit over, to be able to achieve what needs to be achieved. And the support that is available for WOLGA is there is data that we have, and that's actually available also to local governments that don't apply for the money. So there is an assessment has been done for all local lands vested in local government for management in respect of vegetation extent by vegetation type and threatened ecological communities, threatened flora, fauna, wetlands, mapping that I'm happy to share with you. There is assessment. I'm happy to come and help local governments that are developing a local biodiversity strategy with the setting up the steering committee and the prioritization criteria for their local government. Because there is a bit of it depends on where you are and how we can combine it. That's where the updated guidelines provide the examples how it was done. So they can be used, but also, yeah, I'm happy to come and see you and advise on how to do that step from, yes, we identify these priority areas. Here we map them. How do we integrate it? So what can we include? What can be improved in the provisions, for example, of a local planning scheme to help us to increase the protection levels for those areas? And I already started with doing the training on the use of the templates. So the key dates, round 2 closes 8th of December this year. And then the projects are due to be completed by November 2024. Summary. Strategic benefits of the local biodiversity conservation planning are well recognized and worth reminding ourselves of. And that's why it's worth investing in processes such as developing a local biodiversity strategy. And I'm really encouraged that even though after the 2014, when the project wasn't funded anymore, there were quite a few local governments that have initiated and developed local biodiversity strategies since then. So it clearly demonstrates that there is a value in the process. And here are the resources that are available to for local governments, whether you're participating in or applying for the development grants or not. The mapping information is there, the templates will be available, and the updated guidelines. Leave